Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we like to break down some of those really complex legal concepts for you beginners out there. So today we are going to be doing a deep dive into international humanitarian law, or IHL. And you'll sometimes hear this called the rules of war. And it's a pretty big deal, especially if any of you out there are thinking about a career in international law.
Absolutely, it is a big deal. And you've sent over some really fascinating material for us to take a look at today. Treaties, customary law, even some examples from Nepal's recent history. So I think we have a lot to unpack today.
Okay, sounds good. So first things first, what exactly is IHL?
Well, at its heart, it's basically a system of rules. And it's designed to limit the impact of armed conflict for humanitarian reasons. So you can think of it this way. Even in the midst of war, there are certain basic lines that you just don't cross. And IHL is all about protecting people who aren't fighting and setting some boundaries on the way wars are fought.
So it's not about deciding who's right or wrong in the conflict itself.
Exactly. It's not about taking sides. IHL kicks in once a conflict breaks out. And the rules apply equally to all sides, regardless of who started it or what their political goals might be.
Okay, so that makes sense. So it's more about minimizing suffering and not about, picking winners and losers.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Now, IHL does make a distinction between two main types of conflict: international armed conflicts, which involve two or more countries, and then non-international armed conflicts, which happen within a single country.
So a civil war would fall under non-international armed conflict.
Exactly. And the core principles are the same for both. But the specific rules can be more extensive for international conflicts. Because you can imagine conflicts between states often involve a larger scale mobilization and have a greater potential to impact the international community as a whole.
Right, makes sense. So where do these rules actually come from? What makes them binding on all the different countries involved in these conflicts?
That's where things get interesting. There are two main sources of IHL. We have treaties, and then we have customary international law. Now, you're probably pretty familiar with treaties. Things like the Geneva Conventions. Those are formal written agreements between states that lay out specific obligations.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely heard of the Geneva Conventions. But customary international law, that sounds a little bit more mysterious to me. How does that work?
You can think of it like the unwritten rules. The unwritten rules that everyone agrees on, based on how they've consistently behaved in the past, so it develops over time. Through a combination of what countries actually do during conflicts, that's what we call state practice, and what they believe is legally required. And that's called opinio juris.
Okay, so if enough countries consistently act in a certain way during war, and they believe they're legally obligated to act in that way, it becomes part of this unwritten rule book.
Exactly. It's like an unspoken understanding that certain actions are just off limits, even if they're not specifically forbidden in a treaty.
Interesting. Are there any examples of how this customary IHL has kind of shaped the way wars are fought?
Absolutely. A major one is the prohibition against directly targeting civilians. So this idea has been around for a long time, but it's become so deeply ingrained in state practice and belief that it's now considered a core principle of customary IHL.
Right, it seems kind of like common sense. Like, why would you target people who aren't even involved in the fighting?
Yeah, you would think so. But sadly, it does happen more often than we'd like to think. But the point is, thanks to customary IHL, such acts are now universally condemned, and they're considered illegal under international law, regardless of whether a specific country has actually signed a treaty on that particular issue.
Okay, so that's pretty powerful. It sounds like customary law kind of sets a baseline for acceptable conduct during war, even if there are gaps in the treaty coverage.
Exactly. It's a safety net.
Good to know. So we talked earlier about the two types of armed conflict. Why do you think IHL even bothers to categorize them?
Well, because the specific rules might need to be different, depending on whether it's a war between states or something happening inside a single country.
Makes sense.
So international and non-international conflicts trigger different sets of rules. But there is some overlap. For instance, the Geneva Conventions, which are mostly focused on international conflict, they do lay out some fundamental rules that apply to all types of conflict in what we call Common Article 3.
Okay, so how do we know which set of rules to apply in a given situation? It seems like it could get pretty tricky.
Oh, it definitely can. Legal experts really have to carefully analyze the specifics of the situation. Things like the intensity of the fighting, how organized are the groups involved, and the nature of the violence that's happening. Is it just sporadic violence?
Right.
Or is it sustained and organized enough to actually be considered armed conflict in the first place? These are all crucial questions, because if it's not actually an armed conflict, then IHL doesn't even apply.
Oh, wow.
It would be governed instead by international human rights law and the domestic laws of the country that's involved.
Okay, so before we can even talk about which IHL rules apply, we have to figure out if IHL is even the right framework for the situation. We almost need like a referee to decide which rule book we're going to use.
Exactly.
So speaking of referees, one of our sources mentioned a pretty important one when it comes to IHL. You remember who's tasked with actually monitoring how these rules are being followed out in the real world?
Yeah, that would be the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC.
Yes, the ICRC.
And here's something interesting. The ICRC is the only organization that's specifically named in IHL treaties as having a role to play in monitoring compliance with the rules. They have a really long history of working in conflict zones, providing humanitarian aid, and really just trying to make sure everyone is playing by the rules.
Right, so they're kind of like the impartial observers,
Exactly.
working to protect people no matter which side they're on. Got to be a tough job, trying to remain neutral when things are getting really intense.
It is, but it's crucial. They uphold IHL principles, and they make sure those caught in the crossfire have some protection.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of complex situations, we have that fascinating case study you mentioned earlier from Nepal to look at today. I think it'll really help us to see how these IHL principles actually work in a real-world scenario.
Absolutely. Nepal's conflict lasted from 1996 to 2006, and it provides some great insights into how IHL actually applies in practice, especially in a non-international armed conflict.
Okay, so are we ready to dive into that then?
Let's do it.
All right, I think our listeners are going to find this particularly interesting because it touches on a lot of the key concepts that we've already been discussing.
So Nepal's conflict was officially classified as a non-international armed conflict, which is important because it means that the Geneva Conventions and customary IHL applied to both the Nepalese government and the Maoist insurgents.
That makes sense. But I've also seen it referred to as like the Maoist insurgency or the People's War. And those labels don't exactly screen armed conflict to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Those labels are pretty commonly used, but they kind of obscure the fact that this was a conflict between two distinct parties, each with their own obligations under IHL. In fact, the Supreme Court of Nepal actually rejected the label political conflict because it didn't accurately reflect the reality of the situation.
So even though it was contained within Nepal's borders, it was still considered a full-blown armed conflict, subject to all those rules of IHL that we've been talking about.
Exactly, and that's crucial for understanding the legal implications of what happened.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics then. What kind of IHL violations were alleged during the Nepal conflict?
Well, one of the most serious allegations is that both sides potentially committed war crimes by attacking civilians.
Wow. We were just talking about that earlier, how the prohibition against targeting civilians is like a core principle of IHL.
Right. And in the case of Nepal, there are reports that indicate that both the government forces and the Maoists may have been involved in such acts.
Are there any examples of specific incidents from the conflict that we could talk about?
Yeah. The sources you provided mention the targeting of teachers, school children, journalists, and human rights defenders.
That's awful. It sounds like they were deliberately trying to silence dissent and sow fear among the population.
It certainly raises those concerns. And these acts are particularly egregious because they directly violate that principle of distinction that we talked about earlier. You know, these are clearly not military objectives.
Right. Are there any other examples of potential IHL violations in Nepal?
Yeah, in addition to the attacks on civilians, the sources also mention things like hostage taking, which was used as a tactic by both sides.
Oh, wow. I can't imagine the terror of being caught in the middle of that.
It would be absolutely terrifying, and it's a clear violation of IHL. There are also allegations of pillaging medical facilities and obstructing humanitarian aid.
So even in the midst of all this fighting, there are rules that protect those who are trying to provide medical care and humanitarian assistance.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are essential services. And obstructing them can have devastating consequences for the civilian population.
This Nepal conflict really illustrates how complex these situations can be. How do you even begin to sort out who is responsible for what, and how to apply these rules in such a chaotic environment?
You've hit on one of the biggest challenges of IHL. It's one thing to have rules written down on paper, but it's another thing altogether to actually enforce those rules in the real world, especially when you have multiple actors involved, shifting alliances, and just a lot of confusion on the ground.
Right. It's not like there are referees standing on every street corner making sure everyone's following the rules.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have organizations like the ICRC, working in these conflict zones, documenting the violations, providing humanitarian aid, and really just trying to facilitate dialogue between the parties.
So we've talked a lot about the Geneva Conventions today, but you mentioned earlier that there are other treaties that contribute to IHL. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, definitely. There are a whole bunch of treaties that actually build upon the Geneva Conventions,
Hmm.
addressing specific weapons, tactics, and vulnerable groups. For example, there's the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons.
Okay. What kinds of weapons are we talking about here?
This one is all about banning or restricting weapons that are considered excessively injurious or indiscriminate. So, for instance, blinding laser weapons are completely banned, and weapons that produce undetectable fragments.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I can see why those would be considered particularly inhumane. And then there are weapons that are restricted but not outright banned, like mines and booby traps. The convention lays out very specific conditions for their use, really aimed at minimizing civilian harm.
So it's about striking a balance then between military necessity and humanitarian concerns.
Exactly. And sometimes that balance tips decisively toward the humanitarian side, resulting in a total ban. That's what happened with the Ottawa Treaty, also known as the Mine Ban Treaty.
Right, I've heard of that one. It completely outlaws anti-personnel landmines.
Yes. No more planting mines that can indiscriminately kill or maim civilians for years to come.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
It shows that these treaties can actually make a real difference in the world.
they absolutely can. And it's not just about weapons. There are also treaties that focus on protecting specific groups of people during conflict. One that comes to mind is the optional protocol on child soldiers.
Child soldiers, that's horrifying to think about.
It is. This treaty forbids the recruitment or use in combat of anyone under the age of 18.
So it's not just about protecting children from being directly involved in the fighting, but also about preventing them from being exploited and abused by armed forces.
Exactly. Children are particularly vulnerable in conflict situations, and this treaty recognizes the need for special protections.
What other groups are specifically protected under IHL?
Well, there's the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which aims to eliminate the use of these incredibly dangerous weapons.
I have to admit I don't know much about cluster munitions. What makes them so dangerous?
Cluster munitions are bombs that scatter smaller bomblets over a wide area. The problem is that many of these bomblets don't explode on impact, and they can linger for years, essentially turning entire areas into minefields.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the immediate danger of the explosion, but the long-term risk to civilians who might stumble upon these unexploded bomblets years later.
Precisely. The humanitarian consequences are devastating.
It sounds like there's a whole network of treaties out there working to make warfare less brutal, even if we can't eliminate war altogether.
That's a good way to put it. These treaties, along with the Geneva Conventions and customary IHL, form this really complex but essential legal framework for regulating the conduct of war and trying to protect those who are caught in the crossfire.
But having treaties is one thing. How do we actually make sure these rules are implemented and enforced on the ground? That seems like a whole other challenge.
You're absolutely right. That's where the concept of domestic implementation comes in. Countries can't just sign these treaties and call it a day. They have to take concrete steps to make IHL a part of their own legal systems.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, for one thing, it means passing laws that make IHL violations a crime within their own borders. So if someone commits a war crime, they can be prosecuted in their own country, even if the conflict happens somewhere else.
So it's about holding individuals accountable, not just punishing states as a whole.
Exactly. And it's about making it clear that certain acts are just unacceptable, no matter where they occur. Another crucial aspect of domestic implementation is education.
So educating soldiers about the rules of war.
Yes, that's a big part of it. Armed forces need to understand their obligations under IHL and the consequences of violating those rules. But it's not just about soldiers. It's also essential for the general public to understand the basic principles of IHL.
Why is that? What difference does it make if the average person understands IHL?
It makes a huge difference. When the public understands IHL, it creates this culture of respect for the law, and it strengthens the pressure on governments to comply with their obligations. It also helps people to understand the complexities of armed conflict and to advocate for more humane solutions.
So it's about building a broader base of support for the principles of IHL, both within a country and within the international community as a whole.
Exactly. The more people that understand and support IHL, the more effective it will be at protecting human dignity and reducing the suffering caused by war.
I think that's a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basic principles of IHL to the complexities of implementation and enforcement.
We have, but we're not quite done yet. There's another crucial aspect of IHL that I think we need to explore.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What else is there?
It's about the challenges of applying IHL in the modern world, a world that's increasingly complex and technologically advanced. Think about the rise of new weapons, new tactics, and new actors on the battlefield.
Right. Things like cyber warfare,
Mm.
autonomous weapons,
Yeah,
and the involvement of non-state actors.
exactly. These developments are raising a whole host of new questions about how IHL should be interpreted and applied. And those are questions that we need to grapple with. If we want to ensure that IHL remains relevant and effective in the 21st century.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah.
I'm ready to dive into those challenges in our next segment. All right, so we're back and ready to tackle those challenges that you mentioned. It's a bit daunting to think about how IHL can kind of keep up with a world where war itself is changing so rapidly.
Yeah, it really is a complex landscape out there. I think one of the biggest hurdles that we're facing is the rise of these non-state armed groups. Traditionally, IHL is really designed to regulate conflicts between states, but now we're seeing more and more situations where these non-state actors are major players in conflicts.
Right, and those groups don't necessarily follow the same rules or structures as like a traditional military. So how can IHL be applied effectively when you're dealing with organizations that may not even recognize its authority?
It's a big question, and there's no easy answer. But I think one approach is to focus on bringing these groups into the fold, so to speak, by encouraging them to adopt codes of conduct that align with IHL principles.
So kind of like a lead by example strategy, hoping that they'll see the value in adhering to these humanitarian norms.
Exactly. And there's also the legal angle. Even if these groups haven't formally signed treaties, they can still be bound by customary international law, which applies to everyone.
Right. But even if you can get these groups on board with the rules, how do you actually enforce IHL in these situations? It's not like you can just send in the international police to arrest someone for committing a war crime in like a territory controlled by a non-state armed group.
Yeah, you're right. It's incredibly difficult. And that's why documenting violations is so important. Even if immediate justice isn't possible, building a record of abuses can help to ensure accountability down the line.
Okay, so non-state actors are one big challenge. What about the impact of new technologies? It feels like we're constantly hearing about new weapons and new tactics that are kind of pushing the boundaries of what we even consider warfare.
Absolutely. Technology is a total game changer, and IHL is definitely struggling to keep up. I think one of the biggest issues is the increasing use of autonomous weapons systems. Weapons that can select and engage targets without any human control.
Right, like those killer robots we see in the movies.
Yeah.
Except they're not so sci-fi anymore.
Exactly. And it raises a whole host of ethical and legal questions. Can a machine be programmed to comply with those principles of distinction and proportionality and precaution that we talked about earlier? Who's responsible if an autonomous weapon commits a war crime? These are all questions that we just haven't fully answered yet.
It's pretty unsettling to think about those life or death decisions being made by algorithms.
It is. It really highlights the need for ongoing dialogue and debate about how to ensure that technology serves humanity, even in the context of war.
Another area where technology is changing the game is cyber warfare. It seems like cyber attacks are becoming more and more frequent and more sophisticated. So how does IHL even apply in this virtual realm?
Yeah, that's a huge debate right now. Does a cyber attack that disrupts a power grid or a hospital system, does that constitute a violation of IHL? How do you determine the proportionality of a cyber attack when the impact can be so widespread and so unpredictable? These are all questions that are still being debated by legal experts.
So it's not just about updating the rules themselves, but also figuring out how to apply those rules in completely new and evolving contexts.
Exactly. And it requires a shift in thinking. We can't just rely on the way things have always been done. We need to be creative and forward-thinking in our approach to IHL.
So in a way, these challenges are also an opportunity then to refine and strengthen IHL, making it more relevant and more effective in the face of these new realities.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. IHL isn't just this static set of rules. It's this living framework that needs to adapt to changing circumstances. And the more we engage with these challenges, the better equipped we'll be to protect human dignity and limit suffering in the conflicts of the future.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. IHL is clearly a very complex and ever-evolving field. But I think the core message is very clear. Even in war, there are limits, and we have a moral obligation to uphold those limits.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, it's not just about these abstract legal principles. It's about real people whose lives are being impacted by conflict. By understanding IHL, we can all play a part in making sure that, even in the darkest of times, humanity prevails.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this exploration of international humanitarian law. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation.
It really has. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep advocating for a more humane world.
Thanks for tuning in to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified. And be sure to subscribe for more easy-to-follow legal content.